So you've been wondering whether to get a leopard gecko or an African fat-tailed gecko. Well, in today's video we're going to be going over different reasons for why both make good options as pets, but also we'll be going over the main differences between the two different species. So hopefully by the end of this video you will have a better idea on which species would suit you more, which species you should go for. So let's begin the video. So to begin with, there are several differences between a leopard gecko and also an African fat-tailed gecko. First of all, one of the main differences is where they come from or where they are native to. They both come from different areas across the world. For example, African fat-tailed geckos obviously come from Africa, hence the name. And then leopard geckos come from regions such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, India and surrounding areas. So therefore this means that African fat-tailed geckos come from a more humid environment compared to the leopard gecko. And if I'm honest, this is one of the main differences between the two different species. In the wild, African fat-tailed geckos tend to find all the different termites in the ground, and they'll seek out more humid areas than leopard geckos would, which means if you go for an African fat-tailed gecko, you're going to need to provide more humidity than you would for a leopard gecko. Now, a leopard gecko needs roughly about 30 to 40% humidity, whilst African fat-tailed geckos thrive at around 40 to 70% humidity. So this is a very minor difference between the two species, but just keep in mind if you go for an African fat-tailed gecko, you're going to need to provide more humidity, and therefore means that you're going to have to mist down their enclosures every so often just to raise that humidity up to the ideal humidity range. Whereas with a leopard gecko, you don't have to do that whatsoever. Providing you're using the correct heating system and also a suitable substrate, you should naturally get around 30 to 40% humidity anyway if you're keeping a leopard gecko. Now, another difference between the two different species is obviously their appearance. As you can see, leopard geckos tend to have slightly slimmer builds, they tend to have more bumpy skin, and also tend to come in a wide variety of different morphs, whereas African fat-tailed geckos tend to be a lot more stockyish body-wise, and their skin is a lot more smooth and a lot more silky in comparison to a leopard gecko. Their skin's not as bumpy as a leopard gecko. Another thing that you'll probably notice between the two different species is that African fat-tailed geckos have a shorter snout, or their face looks slightly shorter than leopard geckos. But also African fat-tailed geckos usually come in this brown colour, or they'll have a slightly different colour which will be like an earthy sort of tone to them. Still very beautiful though, but if you're looking for something more vibrant, then maybe a leopard gecko might be a great option for you because there's so many different vibrant morphs available. There are different morphs for African fat-tailed geckos, but there just aren't as many of them. Now, setup-wise, both species are virtually the exact same. They both need plenty hides, and they both need a moist hide, as well as lots of foliage. So therefore, they're not really much different between each other. On top of that, their temperatures are virtually the same. Although I will say leopard geckos can take slightly hotter temperatures and also drier conditions compared to the African fat-tailed gecko. African fat-tailed geckos don't do as well with drier conditions. Like we've already mentioned, they need it a bit more humid, whereas a leopard gecko is going to be a lot more tolerant to this. And like I say, leopard geckos can take hotter conditions than the African fat-tailed gecko, and they are a little bit more forgiving if things aren't done correctly. Whereas with the African fat-tailed gecko, if you was to give it too dry of a climate, they could experience dehydration fairly quickly. So that's another factor which you could also consider when deciding which species to go for. So now let's move on to their temperament. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. Now, if you're looking for something that's a little bit more active and a bit more curious as a species, then I'd highly recommend going for a leopard gecko. Leopard geckos tend to be quite dopey, but they're very curious geckos, and their personality genuinely differs from gecko to gecko. Now, if you're looking for a gecko that's a lot more calmer, a lot more slower, and something that's going to be a lot more chilled out whilst you're handling it, then I'd highly recommend an African fat-tailed gecko over a leopard gecko. Now, I'm not saying that leopard geckos aren't tolerant to handling, because they certainly are, but African fat-tailed geckos tend to just sit there on your hand, whereas leopard geckos tend to try and crawl away, or they'll try and move. You tend to have to keep moving your hand in front of the other whilst handling them. But if you want to be able to get something out and just sit down and watch telly and just hold a little gecko whilst you're doing so, then I'd definitely recommend an African fat-tailed gecko because they genuinely are a lot more calmer. Leopard geckos tend to move a lot quicker compared to the African fat-tailed gecko. And like I say, they just tend to move a lot faster and usually won't sit still on your hands, especially the younger leopard geckos. They tend to move a lot more. And this is because leopard geckos are just a bit more adventurous in general. But in all honesty, I find every African fat-tailed gecko that I've had the pleasure of interacting with has always been very, very calm and placid. And they have always been a bit more less skittish, especially as a young juvenile or baby compared to the leopard gecko. Like I say, I'm not saying leopard geckos don't sit still. Usually this does come with time with leopard geckos, and it generally comes down to the specific leopard gecko and their personality. But African fat-tailed geckos are just so calm in general and are a lot more acceptable to handling, especially at a young age. And they tend to be a lot less skittish and scared. Now for their diet, both species are very similar. They're both insect eaters and they both need a variety of different insects in their diet in order to get a good, diverse, nutritional diet. On top of that, both species need calcium and multivitamin supplementation, and they are both extremely similar in this respect, if I'm honest. I will say that African fat-tailed geckos, when you first get them, they can be a little bit more reluctant to eat. It can take them a little bit longer just to get used to you and learn that you're not a threat to them. Whereas with leopard geckos, they tend to still eat even when you've just bought them and taken them home. Like I say, it just might take a little bit longer to build that bond with an African fat-tailed gecko, and part of that is just because they're quite shy of a species. Now it can be tricky to decide which species to actually go for when it comes to both of these species. However, both species make extremely good pets for beginners. Now personally, I much preferred the African fat-tailed geckos over the leopard geckos, and I prefer African fat-tailed geckos purely based on their temperament and the fact that they're a lot more calmer natured. But also I feel like African fat-tailed geckos are so underrated in general, and most people do tend to go for a leopard gecko over an African fat-tailed gecko. But if I'm completely honest with you, it kind of does come down to what you're actually wanting to get out of keeping a gecko. You know, if you're wanting something that's a lot more active and a lot more curious and a bit more adventurous, then definitely go for a leopard gecko over an African fat-tailed gecko. But if you're looking for something that's a lot more calmer and you're mainly looking for hands-on experience, have never kept reptiles before, then genuinely an African fat-tailed gecko could make a really good option for you. Another thing that I will mention about African fat-tailed geckos is they do tend to hide a bit more than leopard geckos. And again, I think this ties back to the fact that leopard geckos are a little bit more adventurous than African fat-tailed geckos. Now, I'm not saying that your African fat-tailed gecko will never ever come out. Obviously, it is going to come out and it's going to move around its enclosure, but I do find that they're not out as much as leopard geckos are. But like I say, it all kind of just depends on what you specifically want from your experience of keeping a reptile. On top of this, leopard geckos and African fat-tailed geckos both are a similar size and are both a manageable size. I will say that I also do find that leopard geckos tend to be a bit more defensive when they feel scared or threatened, whereas African fat-tailed geckos usually just sit still or they'll just go and hide in their hides. They're just not really bothered by things. If I'm completely honest with you, both species are very similar. Like I've already mentioned, they both have similar temperature requirements, ever so slightly different humidity requirements. But like I say, their heating, their lighting, their substrate and enclosure sizing are literally the exact same. And there's only really a few minor differences. But yeah, I hope that this has helped some of you guys out. And I hope this has given you a good idea of the main sort of differences between the two geckos. Personally, I much prefer the African fat-tailed geckos. I will also say that leopard geckos tend to be a lot more easier to get hold of. Sometimes African fat-tailed geckos aren't as easy to get hold of. Yeah, let me know in the comments if you already own a pet leopard gecko or an African fat-tailed gecko. And if you own both species, do let us know in the comments what other differences you have picked up on between the two species. Because I'm sure if there are people stuck between both the leopard gecko and the African fat-tailed gecko, then they would certainly appreciate being able to read other things that other people have noticed. Yeah, don't forget to drop us a like to let me know that you enjoyed the video, and also make sure to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to follow us on social media. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today's video, guys, and yeah, I suppose I shall see you in my next video. See ya!